while the country has suffered the sharpest rise in its poverty rate in more than 50 years. It is expressed in the wanton killings by police of unarmed citizens in cities such as Minneapolis. It is expressed in the enhanced interrogation techniques used by the CIA at secret black sites, Guantanamo Bay, and in our prisons at home. It is expressed in the separation of children from their parents, where they are held as if they were dogs in a kennel. It is expressed in the pornification of American society, where women are tortured, beaten, degraded, and sexually violated, often by numerous men in porn films, and then discarded after a few weeks or months with severe trauma, along with sexually transmitted diseases and vaginal and anal tears that must be repaired surgically. It is expressed in the incel movement that perpetuates violent assaults against women by men who say they have been spurned or ignored by women. It is expressed in the predatory healthcare system where, as Steve Brill writes, a trip to the emergency room for chest pains that turn out to be indigestion can exceed the cost of a semester at college. Simple lab work done during a few days in a hospital can be more expensive than a new car. And a drug that requires $300 to make, and that the manufacturer sells to a hospital for between $3,000 and $3,500 can cost the patient to whom it is prescribed $13,702.
A lot of people have talked about the American decay. We have a lot of people that have talked in why America is making its own citizens suffer. This is called the American sadism. This topic is really, really important. And when you get to look at the lives of people in the United States, at least everyone is going through it. And you ask yourself why. Why is a big country like United States, which is being revered, which is being seen, and America as a continent, which is being respected, which is being seen, still makes its citizens go through a lot of things. Now, I'm going to be presenting you by a presenter, a writer, and also political analyst, Chris Hedges. For those who don't know Chris Hedges is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and a professor who has extensively written on the moral and structural decay of American society. One of the more provocative themes in his work is the concept of American sadism, a term used to describe the systemic cruelty and punitive nature of the American state towards its own citizens. This sadism, as Hedges explains, is not limited to overt violence of policing and incarceration. It extends to everyday bureaucracies, economic systems, and social norms that degrade, humiliate, and control people, particularly the poor and marginalized. In his critique, America punishes its citizens not only physically, but psychologically, socially, and economically. And it does so with a sense of justification that is deeply embedded in the nation's ideological foundations. And to switch this video, it is really, really important because now from Chris Hedges' presentation, it's going to be showing you that everything that you're seeing like happening to the United States is something that was written, and it's something that was there. And it's something that is happening because it was something that was situated to be there. Like everything you see is happening in the United States today, all the ass raids, all the poor decisions that white folks made by choosing Mr. Donald Trump, and all these things, it was done by design so that the majority of people can suffer. This is not a black or white suffering. A lot of people are going through it. Ask any person from the United States and America in general. They're going to be telling you that they are going through something which is making them suffer really a lot. Now, I want to switch this video. I'll be back and then I'll be sharing my thoughts.
It is legally permissible in the United States for corporations to hold sick, children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves to save their sons or daughters. This sadism is expressed in payday loans, for-profit prisons, the privatization of public education and public utilities, and the rise of for-profit mercenary armies. It is expressed in the cultural glorification of violence by mass media, the state, and the entertainment and gaming industries. It is expressed in the nihilistic mass shootings at schools, including elementary schools and workplaces. And it is expressed in the murderous and futile wars we prosecute or support in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. The historian Johann Huizinga, writing about the twilight of the Middle Ages, argued that as things fall apart, sadism is embraced to cope with the hostility of an indifferent universe. No longer bound by a common purpose, a ruptured society retreats into hedonism and the cult of the self. It celebrates, as corporations on Wall Street or popular reality television shows celebrate, the classic traits of psychopaths: superficial charm, grandiosity, and self-importance, a need for constant stimulation, a penchant for lying, deception, and manipulation, and the incapacity for remorse or guilt. Get what you can as fast as you can before someone else gets it. This is the state of nature, the war of all against all Thomas Hobbes saw as the consequence of social disintegration, a world in which life becomes solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It is a world in which powerful men like Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein reduce bodies, the bodies and selfhoods of their victims, to nothing. We know what this sadism looks like. It looks like Derek Chauvin nonchalantly choking to death George Floyd as his police colleagues watch impassively. It looks like Andrew Brown Jr., shot 5 times by police in North Carolina, including once in the back of the head. It looks like Abner Louima, who had a broomstick pushed up his rectum by police in a bathroom at the 70th Precinct Station House in Brooklyn, requiring 3 major operations to repair the internal injuries. It looks like the Navy SEAL Special Operations Chief Edward Gallagher, randomly shooting to death unarmed civilians and using a hunting knife to repeatedly stab an injured, sedated, 17-year-old Iraqi prisoner, and then photographing himself with a corpse. It looks like Iraqi civilians, few of whom had anything to do with the insurgency, naked, bound, beaten, and sexually humiliated and raped and at times murdered by army guards and private contractors in Abu Ghraib. It looks like the prisoners in Abu Ghraib who were routinely dragged across the prison floor by a rope tied to their penises and were sodomized by chemical lights, or had chemical lights snapped open so the phosphorus liquid could be poured over their naked bodies. The leaked pictures from Abu Ghraib are the true face of America. The hooded man, a dark, caped figure standing on a box, arms outstretched, wires attached to his fingers. Or the naked, leashed man lying at the feet of the female American soldier in camouflage pants who holds his leash, one end wrapped around his neck, in her hand. Why is the malaise of a dying civilization expressed through sadism rather than a kind of righteous anger? And here we must turn to Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche warned that those who are humiliated and disempowered are poisoned by ressentiment. Because they have been stripped of agency, they lack the power to harm those who they believe harm them. In short, there is no cathartic release. Ressentiment is bred from damaged self-esteem. It festers and corrodes the soul. The powerless, and here Nietzsche is writing about Christianity as a slave religion, must express their ressentiment obliquely and surreptitiously. Hence the coded racism, Islamophobia, and supposed yearning for a return to the traditional family and quote-unquote Christian values. Ressentiment is produced by feelings of inferiority, failure, and worthlessness. And this ressentiment, fueled by self-loathing, expresses itself through sadism, what Nietzsche calls wrecking the will of those who are weaker or more vulnerable. Nietzsche understood that this wrecking the will of others imparts a perverted, sadistic pleasure. He writes in On the Genealogy of Morals that to see others suffer does one good, to make others suffer even more. Without cruelty there is no festival, and in punishment there is so much that is festive. The ressentiment in American society, the political scientist Wendy Brown writes, is born not only from feelings of powerlessness and worthlessness, but feelings of dethronement and lost entitlement. It explains what she calls the permanent politics of revenge, of attacking those blamed for dethronement, white maleness, those blamed for the dethronement of white maleness, feminists, multiculturalists, globalists, who both unseat and disdain them. For this reason, the rage cannot, as it could be in Christian theology, sublimated into self-abnegation and a call to love thy neighbor. There is, in short, nothing to mitigate or redirect this ressentiment. Its pure expression is nihilism and sadism. Trump embodied this dark ethic. Revenge is his sole philosophy of life. Those gripped by ressentiment are no longer able to create. They can only destroy. They gleefully ignite their own funeral pyre. Laws, institution, and bureaucratic structures are deformed to serve the interests of a tiny cabal, a rapacious elite, which enriches itself at the expense of everyone else. All are made to bow before the dictates of what Max Weber called the inanimate machine. The inanimate machine forces the vast majority into the mass, but it allows a selected few, willing to do its dirty work, to rise above the multitude. These privileged few are given the license and authority to carry out the acts of sadism that have become the primary forms of social control. These enforcers do this work vigorously, for their greatest fear is being pushed back into the mass. The more these foot soldiers for the elite insult, persecute, torture, humiliate, and kill, the more they seem to magically widen the divide between themselves and their victims. And this is why black police and corrections officers can be as cruel and sometimes crueler than their white counterparts. The sadism eradicates, at least momentarily, the sadist's feelings of worthlessness, vulnerability, and susceptibility to pain and death. It imparts feelings of omnipotence. It is pleasurable. I was beaten by Saudi military police and later by Saddam Hussein's secret police when I was taken prisoner in Basra shortly after the First Gulf War. Those who beat me enjoyed their work. I could see it on their faces. Israel's abuse of the Palestinians, the assaults of Muslims on Muslims, and girls in India and the denigration of Muslims in countries we occupy are part of the scourge of sadism in service to an inanimate machine that has become global. Feminists have long understood that sadism runs like an electric current through male sexual desire. Pornography is about the fantasy of men who are omnipotent, who have the power to torture and physically abuse girls and women, who in porn beg to be degraded. Sexual fun and sexual passion in the privacy of the male imagination are inseparable from the brutality of male history, Andrea Dworkin writes. The private world of sexual dominance that men demand as their right and their freedom is the mirror image of the public world of sadism and atrocity that men consistently and self-righteously deplore. It is in the male experience of pleasure that one finds the meaning of male history. Women, of course, are not immune from acts of sadism. Ilse Koch, known as the Bitch of Buchenwald, with her husband, the commandant of the death camp, used to throw prisoners into bears' cages to watch them get ripped apart and devoured. The Chilean, Adriana Rivas, facing extradition to Chile from Australia, reportedly tortured prisoners by strapping them to metal bunk beds rigged with electric current and sending shocks throughout their bodies, or suffocated them to death with plastic bags during the regime of Augusto Pinochet. But Dworkin is right to highlight sadism as inherent in male expressions of total and unaccountable power. And this is why sadism is the chief characteristic of imperialism. Jean Armory, who was in the Belgian resistance in World War II and who was captured and tortured by the Gestapo in 1943, defines sadism as the radical negation of the other, the simultaneous denial of both the social principle and the reality principle. In a sadist world, torture, destruction, and death are triumphant. And such a world clearly has no hope of survival. On the contrary, he desires to transcend the world, to achieve total sovereignty by negating fellow human beings, which he sees as representing a peculiar kind of hell. Armory's point is important. A sadistic society is about collective self-destruction. It is the apotheosis of a society deformed by overwhelming experiences of loss, alienation, and stasis. The only way left to affirm yourself in a failed society is to destroy. Johann Huizinga, in his book, Waning of the Middle Ages, noted that the dissolution of medieval society provoked what he called the violent tenor of life. Today, this violent tenor of life drives people to carry out wanton police murders, evict families, court-ordered bankruptcies, the denial of Medicare to the sick, suicide bombings, and mass shootings. Sadism imparts the rush and pleasure, often with heavy sexual overtones, which lures us towards what Sigmund Freud called the death instinct. The instinct to destroy all forms of life, including our own. When enveloped by a death-saturated world, death, ironically, is embraced as the cure. Joseph Conrad saw enough of the world as a sea captain to know the irredeemable corruption of humanity, the noble virtues that drove characters like Kurtz in Heart of Darkness into the jungle veiled, the abject self-interest, unchecked greed and murder that defines all imperial projects. Conrad was in the Congo in the late 19th century when the Belgian monarch King Leopold, in the name of Western civilization and anti-slavery, was plundering the country. The Belgian occupation, which turned the Congo into a rubber plantation, resulted in the death by disease, starvation, and murder of some 10 million Congolese. In Conrad's short story, An Outpost of Progress, he writes of two white European traders, Collier and Kayerts, who are sent to a remote trading station in the Congo. The mission is endowed with a great moral purpose to export European civilization to Africa. But the boredom and lack of constraints swiftly turn the two men into savages. They trade slaves for ivory. They get into a feud over dwindling food supplies, and Kayerts shoots and kills his unarmed companion. They were two perfectly insignificant and incapable individuals, Conrad wrote, whose existence is only rendered possible through the high organization of civilized crowds. Few men realize that their life, the very essence of their character, their capabilities and their audacities, are only the expression of their belief in the safety of their surroundings. The courage, the composure, the confidence, the emotions and principles, every great and every insignificant thought belongs not to the individual, but to the crowd. To the crowd that believes blindly in the irresistible force of its institutions and its morals, in the power of its police and of its opinion. But the contact with pure, unmitigated savagery, with primitive nature and primitive man, brings sudden and profound trouble to the heart. To this sentiment of being alone of one's kind, to the clear perception of the loneliness of one's thought, of one's sensations, to the negation of the habitual, which is safe, there is added the affirmation of the unusual, which is dangerous. A suggestion of things vague, uncontrollable, and repulsive, whose discomposing intrusion excites the imagination and tries the civilized nerves of the foolish and the wise alike. The managing director of the great civilizing company, for as Conrad notes, civilization follows trade, arrives by steamer at the end of the story. He is not met at the dock by his two agents. He climbs the steep bank to the trading station with the captain and engine driver behind him. The director finds Kayerts, who after the murder committed suicide by hanging himself by a leather strap from a cross that marked the grave of the previous station chief. His toes are a couple inches above the ground, his arms hang stiffly down, and inadvertently, he was putting out a swollen tongue at the managing director. Sadism is carried out in the name of a moral good, to protect Western civilization, quote-unquote Christian values, democracy, the master race, liberté, égalité, fraternité, the worker's paradise, the new man, or scientific rationalism. Sadism will mend the flaws in the human species. The jargon varies, but the dark sentiment is the same. Honor, justice, compassion, and freedom are ideas that have no converts, Conrad writes. They are only people without knowing, understanding, or feeling, who intoxicate themselves with words, shout them out, imagining they believe them without believing in anything else but profit, personal advantage, and their own satisfaction. For man is a cruel animal, he went on. His cruelty must be organized. Society is essentially criminal, or it wouldn't exist. It is selfishness that saves everything, absolutely everything. Everything that we abhor, everything that we love. Bertrand Russell said of Conrad, "I felt, though I do not know whether he would have accepted such an image, that he thought of civilized and morally tolerable life as a dangerous walk on a thin crust of barely cooled lava, which at any moment might break and let the unwary sink into fiery depths." Kurtz, the self-deluded, megalomaniac ivory trader in Heart of Darkness, ends by planting the shriveled heads of murdered Congolese on pikes outside his remote trading station. But Kurtz is also highly educated and refined. Conrad describes him as an orator, writer, poet, musician, and the respected chief agent of the Ivory Company's inner station. He is an emissary of pity and science and progress. Kurtz was a universal genius and a very remarkable person. He is a prodigy, at once gifted and multi-talented. He went to Africa fired by noble ideals and virtues. He ended his life as a self-deluded tyrant who thought he was a god. His mother was half English, his father was half French. Conrad writes of Kurtz, all Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. And by the by, I learned that most appropriately the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance. He began with the argument that we whites, from the point of development we had arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, the savages, in the nature of supernatural beings. We approach them with the might as of a deity, and so on and so on. By the simple exercise of our will, we can exert a power for good practically unbounded, etc., etc. From that point, he soared and took me with him. The peroration was magnificent, though difficult to remember, you know. It gave me the notion of an exotic immensity ruled by an august benevolence. It made me tingle with enthusiasm. This was the unbounded power of eloquence, of words, of burning, noble words. There were no practical hints to interrupt the magic current of phrases, unless a kind note at the foot of the last page, scrawled evidently much later in an unsteady hand, may be regarded as the exposition of a method. It was very simple, and at the end of the moving appeal to every altruistic sentiment, it blazed at you, luminous and terrifying, like a flash of lightning in a serene sky. Exterminate all the brutes. The violence and exploitation which has long defined imperial projects now defines existence at home. For empires, in the end, cannibalize themselves. The tyranny we long imposed on others, we now impose on ourselves. The dark pleasure derived from exploiting others is all that is left. As Nietzsche wrote in On the Genealogy of Morals, let's clarify the logic of this whole method of compensation. It is weird enough. The equivalency is given in this way. Instead of an advantage, making up directly for the harm, hence, instead of compensation in gold, land, possessions, or some sort of another, the creditor is given a kind of pleasure as repayment and compensation, the pleasure of being allowed to discharge his power on a powerless person without having to think about it. The delight in de faire le mal pour le plaisir de le mal, doing wrong for the pleasure of doing it. The enjoyment of violation. This enjoyment is more highly prized the lower and baser the debtor stands in the social order, and it can easily seem to the creditor a delicious mouthful, even a foretaste of higher rank. By means of the punishment of the debtor, the creditor participates in a right belonging to the masters. Finally, he himself for once comes to the lofty feeling of despising a being as someone below himself, as someone he is entitled to mistreat, or at least, in the event that the real force of punishment, of inflicting punishment, has already been transferred to the authorities, the feeling of seeing the debtor despised and mistreated. The compensation thus consists of a permission for and right to cruelty. Social sadism and murder, as Frederick Engels noted in his 1945 book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, is built into the capitalist system. The ruling elites, Engels writes, those who hold social and political control, were well aware that the harsh working and living conditions during the Industrial Revolution doomed workers to an early and unnatural death. The formation of unions and socialism were in direct response to these malevolent forces. As Engels wrote, When one individual inflicts bodily injury upon another, such that death results, we call his deed murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians in such a position that they inevitably meet a too early death and an unnatural death, one which is quite as much a death by violence as that by the sword or bullet, when it deprives thousands of the necessities of life, places them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them through the strong arm of the law to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, which is the inevitable consequence, knows that these thousands of victims must perish, and yet permits these conditions to remain. Its deed is murder just as surely as the deed of the single individual. Disguised, malicious murder. Murder against which none can defend himself, which does not seem what it is, because no man sees the murderer, because the death of the victim seems a natural one, since the offense is more one of omission than of commission, but murder it remains. The ruling class devotes tremendous resources to mask this social sadism and murder. It controls the narrative in the press. It floods our screens with friendly, feel-good images and propaganda perfected by the public relations and advertising industries. These electronic hallucinations distract us from the limitations of our own lives. They obfuscate the fundamental nature of corporate capitalism. They attack our self-esteem and create an embarrassing self-consciousness about our appearance, social standing, and bodily functions. They falsify science and data, as the fossil fuel, animal agriculture, and tobacco industries have for decades. They create, as Guy Debord writes, the spectacular commodity society that is a seductive substitute to participatory democracy. This entrepreneurial tyranny reduces political choice to the sadistic prescriptions provided by corporate power. It creates a society where there is an absence of nearly all positive social and political constructs. Even social change, reduced to identity politics and multiculturalism, has been effectively emasculated by corporate propaganda. A sense of agency, personal power, and social status comes almost exclusively from, as Nietzsche foresaw, serving the sadistic machinery. Enron energy traders, in a dialogue that could have come from any large corporation, were caught on tape in 2000 discussing stealing from California, sticking it to Grandma Millie. Two traders identified as Kevin and Bob dismissed demands by California regulators for refunds because of the company's constant price gouging. So the rumor's true, Kevin says. They're effing taking all the money back from you guys. All this money you guys stole from those poor grandmothers in California. Yeah, Bob says. Grandma Millie, man. But she's the one who couldn't figure out how to effing vote on the butterfly ballot. Kevin. Yeah, now she wants her effing money back for all the power you've charged for effing $250 a megawatt hour. Bob. You know, Grandma Millie, she's the one that Al Gore's fighting for, you know. Later in the conversation, Kevin and Bob denigrate Californians. Kevin, oh, the best thing that could happen is an effing earthquake. Let that thing float out to the Pacific and put 'em effing candles.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing super great from wherever you're watching us. Now, you've heard what Chris Hedges has talked about, and the concept of American sadism really resonates with everything that we are seeing happening today in the United States today. You might be asking yourself, what does the United States stand to gain when its citizens are suffering? You've seen all these crimes, the ICE raids, high cost of living, high taxation, and everything that you're seeing happening today. But you know that America has a chance of controlling all this chaos that is happening, and you're seeing it happening. That shows you that everything that is happening is done by design. Everything is happening by design, because they have the power to stop this, but they cannot stop this, right? And the following is just a review of what Mr. Chris Edges was trying to say, where I'm trying to also highlight some important things, looking at the contemporary things that are happening in the United States today. Now, you get to realize that the idea that America has moved from being republic to oligarchy government by corporate interest, where the state is no longer accountable to the public, but instead exists to protect wealth, suppress dissent, and extract maximum compliance from the masses. As this corporate state consolidates its power, it must rely increasingly on coercion and punishment to maintain order, not just through policing, but through social abandonment. The working class is systematically deprived from adequate healthcare, housing, education, and job security, and then blamed for consequences of their deprivation. I just call this a form of institutional sadism. The deliberate infliction of suffering masked as moral discipline and a personal failure. What is called, I think in simple terms, it's called meritocracy, right? Because they are failing you deliberately when they try to say this. They say that maybe you're the one who's not making it work for you. Maybe you're the one who's not trying to push these hard enough. Also, something interesting that I noted while I was watching the video was brutal expression of this sadism is the American care system. The United States holds roughly 25% of world's prison population, despite having less than 5% of the global population. Prisons in America have become profit-generating enterprises, with private corporations managing facilities and providing services like food, healthcare, and telecommunications. Inmates are often subjected to inhumane conditions, solitary confinement, forced labor, and systemic abuse. Now, Dr. Edges, who has taught in prisons, argues that this system is designed not to rehabilitate, but to dehumanize and crush the human spirit. And this reflects the broader cultural tolerance, even appetite for the suffering of the underserving poor, the criminalized, and the dispossessed. Also, you need to get to understand that beyond prisons, Edges also argues that American sadism can be seen in the way the country treats its poor and working class citizens. Entire communities are abandoned as industries outsource labor to cheaper markets, leaving behind economic deserts with few jobs, failing schools, and overwhelming social services. Now listen, instead of addressing structural causes, the state uses policing and surveillance to manage these populations. Addiction, homelessness, and unemployment are treated as criminal issues rather than public health crises. In this way, suffering becomes normalized and punishment becomes the default response to poverty. This punitive ethos is rooted in the American belief that success is a product of individual merit. So those who fail must be morally defective and deserving what they get. That's how crazy it gets. Chris Edges also links American sadism to the militarization of domestic life. Now, the same military-industrial complex that wages endless wars abroad exports its ideology and technologies of control back home. Police departments are armed with battlefield equipment, schools adopt zero-tolerance policies, and urban centers become zones of occupation rather than support. This militarization not only reflects the deeper fear the elites as of the underclass, particularly black and brown communities, but also conditions the general public to accept surveillance, force, and coercion as ordinary aspects of civic life. The result is a culture in which empathy is eroded and where brutality is valorized as strength. Also, another thing that you need to get to understand is that sadism is psychological and also cultural. Chris Edges argues that mass media, entertainment, and corporate advertising all contribute to a numbing of public's moral sensitivity. Reality television, social media, and violent video games celebrate humiliation, dominance, and spectacles. Citizens are trained to identify with powerful, to laugh at the suffering of others and despise the weak. This creates a society where cruelty is not tolerated but rewarded, a cultural environment that breeds indifference and encourages people to internalize their own oppression as personal failure rather than systemic injustice. Also, education, once seen as path to liberation and critical thought, has also been transformed into instrument of discipline and compliance. Public schools are increasingly underfunded and subject to rigid standards testing regimes, while student debts enslaves generations of young people in the name of opportunity. Colleges functions more like corporate training centers than spaces for intellectual and moral development. Now, for Chris Hedges, this reflects a sadistic turn in policy, where access to knowledge is commodified and the burden of paying for it's placed on those least able to afford it, ensuring that critical thinking and dissent remain out of reach for the masses. Also, something that I need to talk about is healthcare. Healthcare is something else, and I think Chris Hedges talked about the profitability that the United States has been benefiting from healthcare, even without caring about the health of the people, but putting money in front of everything. And this shows you how we are suffering. Just Americans are suffering. Just like 5-6 months ago, we saw people in the United States complaining that they've been paying a lot of money in the healthcare system. They noticed this after people came from the Chinese hub, and they knew this truth. And this all shows you, this is a reflection that this is a reflection that the suffering that you are seeing as an individual is being caused. All the suffering is being engineered, and they want to make the life so hard for you, citizen, so that you get to see really how the life is really hard for normal citizens just like you. Also going to be talking about part of this phenomenon is rooted in politics of resentment. Now, this is where it gets interesting. As economic inequality widens and traditional forms of meaning such as religion, community, or solidarity disappears, many Americans, especially in white working communities, redirect their frustration towards scapegoats, immigrants, black people, LGBTQ plus communities, or Muslims, rather than challenging the elites who actually hold power. They participate in rituals of social punishment and exclusion, often encouraged by right-wing media and political figures. Hedges notes that fascist movements historically arise not simply from economic despair, but from despair that has been moralized and weaponized against others. Also, another thing that I also like to talk about that I think Chris Hedges also talks about is Hedges doesn't stop with institutions. Remember, he also explores the cultural and spiritual implications of this systemic sadism. He argues that American society has undergone a kind of moral collapse where empathy and community have been replaced with narcissism, violence, and spectacle. The glorification of war, the normalization of mass shootings, the obsessions with punitive justice, and the culture of humiliation in media, such as reality TV and viral shaming, all point to a society that derives satisfaction from suffering of others. This reflects that Hedges calls cultural sadism, a population conditioned not just to endure cruelty but to enjoy it, particularly when directed at the powerless. I really want to know what you think about this video. I'm your host and presenter, Agent Stories. Well, until then, I'm hoping to see you on my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.